I could see this look of emergency in his face and terror.
We weren't quite sure exactly what was happening.
She went from a healthy little girl to a girl with one arm.
I didn't even want to go out just because I don't want people to stare at me.
I had no idea what this pain was. I was just petrified.
It was very frightening to see him that way.
This kid who's never been sick, all of a sudden was on death's doorstep.
Next, two medical mysteries that defy the experts. When Carol Kurpiel discovers a mysterious lump on her daughter's back, the 3-year-old is forced to undergo radical surgery. But it's only the beginning of a terrifying journey that will test both patient and parents in ways they could have never imagined.
I was numb. I could not move. I couldn't breathe. We were in this big world with no answers and a dying child.
Then, a seemingly routine blood test sends an entire lab into crisis mode. The only question now is, can they find the answers in time to save Jake Geiger's life?
My whole body was rebelling. I had no idea what was going on.
I thought, oh my God, my son's gonna die.
When illness strikes, we look to doctors to give us answers. But what if they can't? For these unlucky patients, diagnosis is a mystery. High school sweethearts Carol and Fred Kurpiel got married in the summer of love, 1967, and quickly settled down in Peachtree City, Georgia. More than anything, they looked forward to starting a family. But that simple dream would soon turn into a major struggle.
I wasn't able to carry children, so we thought about adoption as our alternative, and we pursued it from there.
The adoption process is not an easy one. But after 10 long years, the Kurpiels finally bring home their adopted son, Derek.
This was what we wanted to do, was be a family. We became instant parents and an instant family.
Then, in the fall of 1981, Carol and Fred decide to go through the whole thing again. But this time, they adopt a baby girl who they name Laura Ashley Kurpiel.
When they put her in my arms, I just couldn't take my eyes off of her. She was beautiful. She had dark, beautiful, curly hair.
Derek is thrilled to have a little sister, and the young parents are delighted to finally have the family they've always wanted. But a few weeks after bringing Ashley home, Carol notices something odd about her daughter's tiny feet.
The large toe on each foot appeared to be much smaller than the rest of her toes, and a little bunion appeared on each toe. I brought this to the attention of the pediatrician.
But after giving little Ashley a thorough head-to-toe exam, the pediatrician assures the Kurpiels that they have nothing to worry about.
He gave me the answer that it could be a cluster toe, which is not uncommon. I wouldn't be concerned. We'll just say that her husband will have expensive shoe bills.
And just as the doctor promised, Ashley doesn't have any trouble learning to walk. In fact, she hits all of her milestones right on time.
As a toddler, Ashley was very precocious. She was adorable.
For the next 2 years, Ashley continues to thrive and appears no different than any other little girl her age. Then, one day in the fall of 1984, while she's fitting her daughter for a new dress, Carol feels something on Ashley's back that sends a chill up her spine.
I ran my hand along the back side of her right shoulder, and I could feel a very large, warm lump. It was full and red and warm to the touch. It was very scary looking. It was like someone had pumped air up into the right side of her body. I couldn't believe it.
It was as if you got bit by a wasp or a yellow jacket, but in a much, much bigger area. I mean, it was like the size of a man's hand.
I was so panicky, I just couldn't think of anything else but this lump on her back. So we went into the emergency room, we brought our child and said, here we are, please someone see her.
While the Kurpiels wait and worry, their little girl undergoes an extensive battery of tests.
Everyone wanted to come in and see who this little girl was with this mysterious lump on her back. There were so many doctors coming in and out of there, a lot of whispering, a lot of second guessing. So you're sitting there waiting and you want answers and no one seems to be giving you the answers.
The pediatric surgeon believes he can get closer to answering some of these questions, but only if he first secures a biopsy of the lump. Carol and Fred quickly agree. And when 3-year-old Ashley is wheeled into the OR, they're hoping the whole ordeal will soon be over.
After they finished with the biopsy, we were told to return home and that we would get a call that evening if the results came through.
That night, the phone rings, but the call brings more questions than answers.
He said, I just called to give you some news. She has infantile fibromatosis.
Infantile fibromatosis is a benign but aggressive tumor that usually appears in young children on the head, neck, or shoulder. They often grow rapidly and can invade the child's muscles, nerves, and tendons.
They explained that it wasn't a malignant cancerous tumor or anything like that. You know, it wasn't a major problem.
He more or less indicated that we're not going to do anything, we're just going to watch it. I couldn't quite understand what he meant by just watching it. You didn't watch tumors, you didn't watch cancer, you had surgery. And we looked at each other and said, maybe a second opinion would be appropriate.
Taking matters into their own hands, the Kurpiels immediately set up an appointment with an oncologist. Little do they know their world is about to be turned completely upside down.
The doctor said that infantile fibromatosis needed to be dealt with through surgery. This was not anything that you watched.
The oncologist orders a CAT scan. And when the findings come in, alarm bells go off. It appears as though the growth has already spread into Ashley's right arm. And if he doesn't surgically remove the tumor immediately, it will continue to grow. Suddenly faced with this drastically different opinion, Carol and Fred aren't sure what to do.
He kept saying, you don't know until you get in what you're going to find. I can tell you that we'll probably just need to remove that muscle.
We thought about it and agreed to bring Ashley in and to do this. That was the family decision.
The next day, Carol and Fred are a bundle of nerves as they count down the hours to the surgery. But they do their best to keep it together for the sake of their little girl.
There was a song that she used to sing so well, You Are My Sunshine, and she was singing that before they came to take her away. We got her to sing because she was a little curious as to what was going on. We told her someone was going to have to take her.
She got a little bit terrified. The person that came in was in their surgical outfit, and I picked her up, and I was the last person that actually handed her over.
She was crying. She didn't want us to give her away, she kept saying. Well, she's got to do it. She's got to go. And that was the last we saw of her.
As the medical team begins the surgery, Carol and Fred settle in for what they know will be the most agonizing day of their lives. But just halfway into the 5-hour procedure, one of the surgeons comes barreling through the OR doors.
His eyes were wide open, his hands were very red and stressful looking, and I could see this look of emergency in his face and terror. And it was like, did he do something wrong? Did something happen? And he said, oh, Mrs. Kurpiel, where's your husband? I said, well, I just sent him upstairs a little while ago. And he said, well, I have no time to wait for him. We need to talk right away. He was telling me, we've gone through this surgery as far as we can go. I have dissected and dissected. He said, and this tumor has gone up under her arm, around her arm, down her back, around her side. He said, it's just amazing. I have just got to take the arm and shoulder in order to get it all. I kept having him repeat this to me. Do I understand what you're saying? This whole arm has to come. And he said, yes. He said, and I don't have time to wait for your husband. I have to have your permission. We need to get this arm off. I've left her in a terrible state. We've got to get this thing off.
A team of doctors has just discovered that a growth called fibromatosis has invaded a huge section of 3-year-old Ashley Kurpiel's right side. The chief surgeon is now convinced that their only option is to amputate the little girl's entire arm and shoulder.
To get it all, he had to take everything. There could be no waiting for my husband to come back downstairs. Do you understand me, Mrs. Kurpiel? He kept saying, do you understand me? And I just found myself agreeing, shaking my head yes.
Carol came and got me and said that the surgery was so invasive that it got to a point that there were basically just ligaments holding her arm on, and that they would have to take the arm off. It wasn't a matter of a decision whether we should or we shouldn't.
5 hours later, the surgeon pronounces the amputation a success. And when they're finally allowed to see Ashley, it takes everything in their power just to keep it all together.
I couldn't quite focus. I knew that I was going to have a child with no arm, but at the same time, the demon would be out of her body. And so I had to focus on that.
We're trying to be the strong parents and look at the upside of things. You do what you have to do at the time.
She was on a lot of machinery. I remember hearing the sounds of the pumps, and where her arm and shoulder were was a big pillow.
The next day, the Kurpiels are told that Ashley needs to begin physical therapy immediately.
She had to get up and start walking right away. So they brought a little doll's carriage in, and they asked her to push it down the hall. And before we knew it, she was pushing that stroller down the hallway.
And I remember distinctly the doctor saying, "It seems like she'll be more of a fighter."
Over the course of the next 2 weeks, Ashley exceeds everyone's expectations. And the doctor soon decides that she's strong enough to go home for the Christmas holidays.
Having Ashley home was wonderful. She's a bright, wonderful child.
But as little Ashley begins getting used to life with one arm, Fred and Carol are having a much harder time adjusting to how the world sees their daughter.
She went from a healthy little girl to a girl with one arm. She was pretty astounding to look at. 1/4 of her body was missing.
As the harsh new reality sinks in, the young parents vow to do all that they can to help their only daughter lead a full and productive life.
Ashley was still Ashley. There was no doubt about that. I mean, she was a darling little girl.
Slowly, the family begins to reestablish a sense of normalcy, but it's not to last. One morning during the spring of 1985, Carol is getting Ashley dressed when, to her horror, she notices an all-too-familiar bump on the left side of her daughter's back.
There was this big, huge lump, and it was just like the other side. And I immediately panicked because I thought, oh, no way is this going to happen again.
In a state of panic, Carol rushes Ashley to the closest emergency room. But after performing a thorough exam, the on-call doctor assures the anxious mother that there's nothing to worry about.
He kept saying, there's nothing on that side. That swelling is probably due to the fact that she's overusing her left arm. When he said it was overuse, I totally believed him, and I think it's because I wanted to believe him.
Carol breathes a huge sigh of relief and takes her daughter home. Sure enough, within a week, the swelling in her left shoulder starts to go down. But just to be on the safe side, they begin bringing Ashley to pediatric orthopedist Dr. William Schmidt for routine checkups.
The Kurpiels seemed like they were coping with everything they had been through very well, probably more than I would have.
But during the first couple of visits, Carol begins to notice an alarming new pattern of behavior.
She would run to the elevator to hit that button, and she couldn't reach that button no matter how hard she tried. I said, come on, Ashley, you can do it. Get that arm up there. And she kept saying, but I can't, it hurts. If I do that, it hurts.
After all that Ashley's been through, the Kurpiels can't bear the thought of anything else going wrong.
She demonstrated her lack of motion of one shoulder and one arm, and I just was very suspicious.
Little do the Kurpiels realize that during this seemingly routine visit, their life is about to spiral out of control again. Concerned by the development, Dr. Schmidt orders an X-ray of Ashley's left shoulder. And almost as soon as he sees it, he realizes that something is very wrong.
I obtained an X-ray which revealed some calcification in the paravertebral muscles. Calcification is the laying down of calcium and bone in the muscle. Fibromatosis does not, as a rule, develop any calcification. At that point, I didn't feel that she had fibromatosis.
I couldn't believe he was saying this to me. We had just gotten an okay to continue with our lives.
My first reaction is seeing that she had undergone the amputation based on the diagnosis of fibromatosis. To say I was overwhelmed was putting it mildly. The findings to me were very definite, but I just was hoping I might be wrong.
Just as Carol and Fred Kurpiel are beginning to come to terms with their daughter Ashley's amputation, Dr. William Schmidt has uncovered new evidence that suggests the amputation may have been completely unnecessary.
The more I reviewed my findings, I felt very saddened for the Kurpiels and Ashley.
Dr. Schmidt is confident that a strange calcification that's developed on Ashley's spine proves that she's suffering from an extremely rare and devastating disease. He takes a deep breath and picks up the phone to tell the Kurpiels exactly what he's found.
We were getting ready for our annual Memorial Day picnic, and I was in the kitchen getting a few things, and the phone rang. And it was Dr. Schmidt. And he sounded so sad to me, and I thought, what is this about?
I told her that after reviewing all the information I had obtained from evaluating Ashley, I felt that she had fibrodysplasia, ossificans progressiva.
Fibrodysplasia ossificans progressiva, or FOP, is one of the most disabling genetic conditions known to medicine. In healthy individuals, a genetic signal instructs the body where and when to form bone. This begins as the skeleton is formed in the embryo. In patients with FOP, the mutation of a single gene alters these instructions, triggering sporadic and unnecessary bone growth, or ossification, in muscle mass throughout the body. In essence, the patient begins growing an extra skeleton.
As the patient progresses, on X-ray, one can see the development of bone in areas where there should be no bone, in unusual areas. In looking at Ashley's X-rays, the bone was developing more progressively and certainly becoming more definite for FOP.
I never heard of this $1 million word. I had to write it down to make sure I could even spell it correctly. I asked him to explain everything to me, what I needed to know.
To begin with, Ashley first exhibited signs of the debilitating disease when she was just 2 months old. What another doctor considered cluster toes was, in fact, the initial onset of the disease.
The patient with FOP, as a rule, definitely has shortening and abnormal development of the great toes in each foot.
And then, over time, the disease just took on a life of its own.
As the patient develops bone in the muscles, they will develop these areas of swelling that are tender. I think at the time that she had her first symptoms in the right shoulder, that was probably her first flare-up.
He goes on to explain that the latest swelling in Ashley's left shoulder is a clear indicator that the muscles in her remaining arm are beginning to transform into bone as well.
Eventually, her body would become very rigid, and basically, they become immobile. I couldn't believe I was hearing this. It was just so unbelievable.
As the Kurpiels struggle to come to terms with a devastating diagnosis, they can't help but wonder why no other doctor was able to put the pieces of the puzzle together.
On the biopsy, fibromatosis can look a lot like FOP. So it can be a very difficult pathological diagnosis to make because it was so rare. It just was not expected.
The Kurpiels' next step is to reach out to the world's leading expert on FOP, Dr. Fred Kurpiel. And their first question is one they can hardly bear to ask.
I wanted to know, did the arm come off for no reason?
The amputation was done to save her life at that point because of the enormous amount of difficulty that was encountered. I don't think that the surgeons planned to do an amputation when they took Ashley into the operating room. Nevertheless, she came at it with an amputation and a catastrophic event that changed the rest of her life.
It was a misdiagnosis, and there was a surgery that shouldn't have been done, and it was just absolutely devastating information to get.
Unfortunately, almost 90% of FOP patients around the world are misdiagnosed. Not only misdiagnosed, but often have dangerous, painful, unnecessary procedures that actually worsen their condition.
In fact, research has proven that any sort of trauma or invasive procedure in an FOP patient can trigger catastrophic explosions of new bone growth.
Once the bone forms, it stays there. Sometimes spontaneously, but often after minor bruises and injuries, the FOP gets activated again. It's like a bear that's sleeping. Sometimes it sleeps, and sometimes it doesn't take much to wake this bear from a hibernation, and that bear becomes very angry, attacks other skeletal muscle, and eventually replaces almost all of the body's skeletal muscles with extra bone. This is a complete metamorphosis.
Unfortunately, it is a metamorphosis that will continue for the rest of Ashley's life. There is no known cure or treatment for FOP.
At that time, there was very little known about this condition, and we had no other medications to administer these patients.
Without any way to stop the second skeleton from growing, Ashley's prognosis is grim.
The ultimate progression of the disease can lead to an early death. And the way that usually occurs is that chest expansion is limited and the patient has difficulty ventilating and expanding the lungs to get the adequate oxygen necessary.
I remember crying uncontrollably. I asked him how long he thought she had to live, and he said he thought it would be anywhere between 2 and 10 years because she was progressing so fast. I was numb. I could not move. I couldn't breathe. What was I to do? We were in this big world with no answers and a dying child.
When Ashley Kurpiel was 3 years old, she was diagnosed with FOP, an extremely rare, crippling, and often life-threatening bone disorder, and her doctors didn't expect her to live past age 10. But as it turns out, Ashley is a survivor who has been beating the odds for almost her entire life.
From a very young age, and I never knew anything else besides having FOP.
Unfortunately, coping with her disease has often been made worse by the pain of being different.
It was very hard. Sometimes I didn't even want to go out just because I don't want people to stare at me.
A lot of kids were a little bit afraid of her because she was so different looking.
In an attempt to help their daughter fit in, the Kurpiels decide to get Ashley a prosthetic arm when she enters 2nd grade.
I wanted her to be normal, so I would send her to school in this little arm, and I felt very fulfilled because I could see a whole body.
I didn't have any muscle to operate anything, so this huge piece of plastic wrapped around the back of my neck underneath my left arm up on my chest. I went to school one day and I came off the school bus and the arm was turned around and like hanging off my back.
She'd say, "Hi, Mommy," and I'm looking at this arm behind her, and all the kids are kind of and I said, "Ashley, your arm, quick," and I'd bring it forward, and she'd say, "Oh, okay," and she'd pull it forward, and I'm thinking to myself, she's wearing this arm for me, not for her. I said, "Ashley, let's throw this in the garbage." Okay.
Throughout her adolescence, Ashley does her best to lead as normal a life as possible. But the disease is slowly ravaging her fragile body.
I've had flare-ups on and off my whole life. I lost mobility in my left arm slowly. I used to reach my forehead and comb my hair, and then over time, I wasn't able to anymore.
I wish there was such a thing as a mild case of FOP, but there really isn't.
Today, Ashley is 26 years old. Her left arm is essentially frozen from the elbow up. She has limited movement in her neck, and her right hip and leg are fused in a semi-sitting position. She now wears a custom-made shoe, which helps compensate for the irregular shape of her leg.
As much as I hate FOP and what it does to our body and the pain it causes, I can't imagine my life Without it, I wouldn't be who I am. If I didn't have this, I can't imagine not being me.
Despite the disabling disease, Ashley lives a very active life. She works for her father at their home office, coordinating corporate conferences, and spends most of her free time volunteering. The Kurpiels remain hopeful that during Ashley's lifetime, researchers will find a cure. In just the last 2 years, Dr. Fred Kurpiel and his team have identified the gene that causes FOP.
It was a gene that encoded a switch that was involved in bone formation. Our job now is trying to understand the exact reason that the switch is behaving that way and to design the right drug to prevent that switch from causing this second skeleton to form.
When the cure happens, it's going to be a huge, huge deal for all of us and the kids to come that haven't even been diagnosed yet, that they won't have to deal with what we've dealt with.
Because we have Fred Kurpiel in our lives, I sleep better at night. The fact that they found the gene gives me all kinds of hope, and there is hope for Ashley, indeed. She looks for the day when she will have a lot of freedom as far as her body goes. If I had to sum it all up for Ashley, I'd have to say to be continued.
I tell a lot of people there are a lot of things in life that you can't change, but there's one thing you can do, and it's just live with it.
While little Ashley Kurpiel's family learned early on that she was suffering from a devastating disease, Jake Geiger went for more than 20 years before realizing that he was living with a condition that could kill him at any moment. As he was growing up in Cleveland, Ohio, Jake Geiger's parents did everything they could to instill in their children a strong work ethic.
My parents worked, so I had to be self-sufficient. I would cook dinner for the family. That's how we are.
They were a family that encouraged each other to follow their dreams. So, in 2003, when he's accepted into a university filmmaking program, his parents are thrilled, despite the fact that he'll be living 500 miles away in New York.
We told him he had to call once a week, whether he wanted to or not. And so every Sunday, usually, he would call us.
Jake's freshman year is everything he'd hoped for. And as his parents help him move into the sophomore dorm in the fall of 2004, they're all looking forward to another great semester. And then, the seemingly ordinary day takes a surprising turn.
When I was lifting things, it felt like someone was squeezing a clamp on my backside. I didn't tell my parents I was in pain. I just didn't want to worry them or anything. I just thought, it'll pass.
But after saying his goodbyes to his parents, the bizarre pain seems to take on a life of its own.
I had no idea what this pain was. It would get tighter and tighter, and the pain would shoot up my back and in all directions. I had to go investigate, so I went to the bathroom, and I found that it was an open sore with pus and blood coming out. I thought, this thing probably isn't going away. I should get some help with this.
The next morning, he heads to the nearest hospital hoping that someone there can put a quick end to the irritating open sore. Sure enough, the doctor takes one look at it and is confident that Jake has a classic pilonidal cyst. An abscess that usually develops in the crease of the buttocks, becomes infected and causes intense pain. It is often caused by an ingrown hair follicle.
He'd seen him before, you know, the routine. He anesthetized the area, cut it, he dug out all the blood, and bandaged me up. I was ready to get on with my life.
Jake is back to his old self in a few days and wastes no time digging into his studies. But his usual all-nighters seem to be taking an uncharacteristic toll on him. He begins experiencing migraines every couple of months. Yet when he tells his parents, they're not overly concerned.
From my mother's side of the family, we get migraines. I get migraines. All our sons get migraines. So having a headache is not unusual.
But when Jake goes home for winter break in January of 2006, a series of unexpected, piercing headaches set in. They're unlike anything he's experienced before.
They start getting worse and worse and more frequent. When I get a migraine, I take a pillow, put it over my head, and just try and get to sleep. For these new headaches, it was different. I would put the pillow over my head, and wasn't really working the same way.
And no matter how many over-the-counter pain relievers he takes, nothing seems to dull the incessant pain. By the following week, the constant throbbing is beginning to wear him down, and he finds himself spending more and more time in bed.
I was just tired all the time. The headaches were just draining all my life out of me. I just didn't want to have anything to do with the world.
Jake begins sleeping more than 12 hours a day, hoping that the piercing pains will eventually go away. But he's completely taken aback when a bizarre new symptom suddenly emerges.
I started to notice a change in my urine. It was turning like a bright orange. I made sure to tell my father and ask for his advice.
I wasn't sure why it was that color. Thought maybe he wasn't drinking enough fluids, or maybe ate too many carrots, I don't know.
When the unsettling symptoms don't seem to rattle his parents, Jake relaxes a bit and does his best just to get back into his regular routine. At the end of winter break, he packs up his bags and heads back to school. But as he's carrying his suitcase into the dorm, he's suddenly overcome by a familiar feeling.
I started to feel a little bit of a tingle again in my backside. I realized, yes, I have another cyst forming.
Determined to deal with the annoying cyst before it gets too big, Jake checks in with the nurse at the Student Health Center. And upon taking one look at him, she's sure something is very wrong.
She said I was jaundice. I didn't notice because I'd been living with it. So apparently, over however long, I had been turning yellower and yellower.
As Jake walks her through the debilitating headaches, the overwhelming fatigue, and strange colored urine, she realizes that whatever he has is out of her league. The nurse immediately calls security to escort him to the hospital.
My whole body was not acting right. It was rebelling. I had no idea what was going on.
When 20-year-old Jake Geiger shows up at his school's health center looking jaundiced, the nurse immediately calls campus security to rush him to the nearest hospital. She's sure that an infected cyst on his rear end is causing his body to go haywire.
Even though I was jaundiced, she thought it was because of the cyst.
The ER doctor takes one look at the growth and is convinced that there's only one plan of attack. The infected cyst has to be surgically removed. Otherwise, it will keep coming back.
This time, instead of cutting and draining it right there, he wants to remove the entire area.
But Jake doesn't give it too much thought. He figures it's the only way to get rid of the painful cyst for good. And when the doctor sends him to the lab for some pre-op blood work, he follows orders.
So I gave them my blood, and they sent me on my way.
But the next day, Jake gets a phone call that catches him off guard.
Some doctor on the phone tells me that there's some discrepancy with my blood work. They just want me to come in for another 2 or 3 hours just to make sure I'm okay. Then I went straight in from there.
As soon as Jake arrives at the hospital, he's shocked to find a team of doctors waiting for him. Next thing he knows, Jake is rushed into an ER exam room where they proceed to draw 6 vials of blood.
I was kind of worried that they were taking so much blood from me. I didn't really think it was necessary.
Little does he know that his blood test results are causing a commotion in the lab. For the last several hours, they've been running a series of highly specialized tests, trying to figure out what's causing his platelet and blood cell counts to plummet. And when they can't figure it out, they call in hematologist Dr. Arshad Sheikh to take over the bizarre case.
I was consulted because they were very concerned that something serious may perhaps be going on.
Dr. Sheikh immediately heads down to Jake's room and begins his investigation with a thorough exam.
I was looking for any evidence of any bleeding or bruising or any enlargement of certain organs, but his exam was unrevealing.
Completely baffled, Dr. Sheikh is back to square one. He insists that Jake be admitted to the hospital in the hope that he can get to the bottom of his case.
I was kind of scared by this, but I didn't want to worry my parents, so I didn't bother calling them.
But when Debbie Geiger doesn't hear from Jake that weekend, red flags immediately go up.
We usually talk to Jake every Sunday, and this Sunday came and went and we hadn't talked to him. And at that point, I knew that something was wrong, and I knew that I had to track Jake down.
When Jake doesn't answer his cell phone, she begins to panic and immediately calls the hospital closest to his school.
I asked if they had a patient by the name of Jake Geiger, and they said yes, they did. First thing I did was to ask why. Why was he there?
The nurse refuses to give her any answers, but does transfer the anxious mother to the phone in Jake's room.
I said, Jake, why haven't you called? He said, I didn't want to worry you.
The entire time I was just trying to reassure her that everything was gonna be all right. It was just a little bump in my blood work, that's all.
Of course, my first reaction was to go there. And he said, no, I'll be in and out before you'd even get here.
The next morning, Dr. Sheikh heads directly to the lab. He wants to take a look at Jake's blood himself.
When I looked at Jake's blood under the microscope, I found that a lot of his red cells were fragmented in every field of view, as well as that his platelet count was extremely low.
Platelets in the blood help form clots to stop the body from bleeding. A normal platelet count is between 150 to 450, but Jake's count is a shockingly low 26.
The clinical picture that Jake had is not something that people see commonly. I was very concerned because this was something that was life-threatening and needed to be treated immediately.
Just 24 hours ago, Jake Geiger was told that his platelet count is precariously low, and no one in the hospital can tell him why. But after discovering a vital clue in Jake's microscopic blood samples, Dr. Arshad Sheikh thinks he may be onto something.
When I walked into Jake's room, he was very scared.
I had no idea what was going on with me. I was in suspense.
Dr. Sheikh takes a moment to collect his thoughts before delivering the diagnosis that he knows will be difficult for his young patient to swallow.
When I saw Jake's blood under the microscope, in my mind, it was TTP until proven otherwise. TTP stands for thrombotic thrombocytopenic purpura.
Thrombotic thrombocytopenic purpura, or TTP, is a blood disorder that causes clots to form in blood vessels throughout the body. In healthy individuals, a protein called the von Willebrand factor works in tandem with platelets to form clots and stop bleeding. But in patients like Jake, the von Willebrand factor runs amok, causing too many platelets to spring into action. When this happens, unnecessary and potentially life-threatening blood clots form.
A lot of what happens with TTP is still poorly understood, but what we have gathered is that you have huge molecules of this von Willebrand factor plugging up different areas in the body, different organs, leading to multiple organ failure.
Dr. Sheikh told me that my body was shutting down, and at this point, I'm pretty scared because I don't know how to take in all this information.
As Jake struggles to understand the devastating disorder, it becomes clear that the seemingly harmless headaches he's been living with all these months are directly linked to TTP.
TTP can result in headaches because there are small blood clots being formed in the brain. When you have all these clots throughout the body, the blood passes through the clots and it destroys the red cells.
Dr. Sheikh goes on to explain that this destruction of Jake's red blood cells caused excess amounts of the yellow byproduct bilirubin to circulate in the bloodstream and dissolve in his skin, making him appear jaundiced. Even Jake's strangest symptom, the orange urine, had been triggered by the disorder.
The urine in TTP may change color to orange or simply because destruction of the red cells and their byproducts get filtered through the kidney.
I was just kind of perplexed. This was all completely alien to me.
But just when he thinks it can't get any worse, Dr. Sheikh drops another bombshell.
The mortality rate if TTP is left untreated is 90 to 100%. Jake needed urgent treatment, otherwise he was going to die.
It was then that it washed over me exactly the magnitude of what I had.
Completely overwhelmed, Jake agrees to let Dr. Sheikh admit him to the intensive care unit. As he's being wheeled down the hall, the gravity of the situation sinks in, and he finally calls his parents to let them know exactly what's going on.
When Jake used the words ICU, I thought, oh my God, my son's gonna die.
You know, you always expect your children are going to outlast you, and this kid who's never been sick all of a sudden was on death's doorstep.
In a race against time, the Geigers pack their bags and begin the 500-mile drive to New York.
And it seemed like an eternal drive. It just didn't end.
As his parents drive through the night, Dr. Sheikh wastes no time starting Jake on a treatment. While there is no cure for TTP, a procedure called plasmapheresis can restore his platelet count.
When a plasmapheresis is performed, the patient is hooked up to a plasma exchange machine, and plasma from the patient is taken into the machine, and the patient is reinfused with donor plasma.
The 4-hour procedure will remove the defective portions of Jake's blood and effectively reinfuse him with a healthy supply of platelets. He will need to undergo the procedure daily until his platelet count is back to normal.
It was a pretty demanding procedure. It took a lot out of me. I felt like I was seeing colors. About an hour and a half into it, I would just pass out.
The next day, as Jake is getting ready for his second treatment, his parents arrive, and nothing could have prepared them for the condition they find him in.
When we got there, he was very out of it, very lethargic, and it was very frightening to see him that way.
But as the days go by, Jake's platelet count begins to climb. And after 2 weeks of treatment, his count reaches the 300 mark.
Jake's blood counts were normalizing. At that point, we knew that Jake was in remission.
Finally, Dr. Sheikh discharges Jake from the hospital. And for the first time in months, he's starting to feel like his old self again.
It felt real great to have my freedom back, to be able to move around, to actually be able to live again.
Jake comes to terms with the fact that he's going to have to follow up with a hematologist on a regular basis in order to keep the TTP in check. But he has a harder time understanding why Dr. Sheikh was the only doctor able to recognize the lethal disorder.
The diagnosis of TTP is often overlooked because the symptoms can be very nonspecific and it can go unnoticed. If Jake had not come in because of his cyst, this would have gone undiagnosed and he would have had progressive organ failure and he would have died.
According to Dr. Sheikh, Jake's pilonidal cyst was unrelated to his TTP. And interestingly enough, it seems to have healed on its own.
It was really a lucky coincidence that I had the cyst. If it wasn't for the cyst popping up again, I probably wouldn't have discovered the TTP until it was too late.
Today, Jake lives in New York City, hoping to make a name for himself in the film business. And while he has not experienced another TTP relapse, his mother continues to worry about her eldest son.
I think I'm more protective now than I ever was of Jake. If he displays that he's not feeling well, I become even more concerned, and I think that's always going to be that way.
What I learned from this ordeal is that you have to watch out when you're sick and not just think, oh, it's just a headache. No, there's probably a cause for that headache. This whole experience makes me value life a lot more. It makes me value my family and my friends and just getting out and seeing the world.